Hello, and welcome to today's panel discussion on race and party platforms in the coming Nova Scotia elections. I'm Kevin Quigley, Scholarly Director of the McEachern Institute for Public Policy and Governance. As we begin this event, the McEachern Institute acknowledges that we're here today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We also recognize the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who have been here for over 400 years. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to announce the winners of our student op-ed competition. A big thank you to all those who entered our student competition. We had a number of great submissions on a variety of topics. I congratulate you for offering your views on important policy issues. I'd also like to thank the McEachern Institute founding fellows who adjudicated the process, Professor Jackie Gahagan from the Faculty of Health, Dr. Ren Thomas from the School of Planning, and Professor Larry Hughes from Engineering. There are 3 honorable mentions and 1 winner. The honorable mentions listed in alphabetical order by last name are Catherine Amour with Dying for Treatment, Access to Clinical Eating Disorder Treatment in Nova Scotia. Second is Jonathan Gowd with Nova Scotia Continues to Violate the Constitutional Rights of Seniors and Persons with Disabilities. And the third honorable mention is Gabriel Nicholson with Nova Scotia Needs an Energy Policy Update. The winner of the op-ed competition is Claire Beliveau with Invest in the Safety of Students Against Sexual Violence. The review committee commented that Claire's op-ed was well written on an important policy issue, it was well framed, and solution-oriented. Congratulations, Claire. We'll be in touch with Claire and the authors of the honorable mentions shortly. We'll be following up with everyone who submitted an op-ed, and we'll be inviting them to a workshop on how to pitch to the media. Stay tuned for details. We'll be in touch. Once again, thank you to those who entered, and thank you to the fellows who participated. The op-eds were all extremely well written, and I was delighted by the turnout and the enthusiasm and the important subjects that you touched on. It was very, very impressive taken as a whole, the competition. So thanks so much, and we'll be doing this again in the future for sure. I'd also like to announce that we'll be hosting a panel on April 1st, 3 weeks from today, 1 to 2, the same time as now, on trust and uncertainty at the Science Policy Interface. This event will be hosted in partnership with the Faculty of Medicine and the Faculty of Agriculture at Dalhousie. The purpose of this April Fool's Day panel is to explore how scientists present research, identify uncertainty, provide advice, and communicate with policymakers and the media. This is a particularly salient topic in light of the dependence on science and scientists during COVID-19. We've secured a number of distinguished speakers. It will be an excellent panel. On today's business, today's panel discussion is the final event in our Policy Matters speaker series leading up to the next provincial election in Nova Scotia. Over the last month, we've hosted experts in long-term care, tourism, and climate adaptation, and today's panel features 4 women working on the front lines of racial justice in Nova Scotia. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Ajay Parasram, our moderator for today's discussion. Ajay is a founding fellow at the McEachern Institute and an assistant professor at Dalhousie University. Cross-appointed to the Departments of International Development Studies, History, and Political Science. His research investigates various aspects of the colonial present, including state theory, structural white supremacy, and racial justice. We are pleased to have Ajay moderate today's discussion. Ajay, over to you.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Al. Thanks, Kevin. That was a wonderful amateur Zoom mistake. I can't believe anybody's making those mistakes at this point in the pandemic. I just wanted to start. I'm going to jump right into this and say, when Kevin approached me with the idea for this panel, I got really excited about it because, as a BIPOC person living in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia since the 1980s, it's been a simmering source of rage and disbelief, in my opinion, about how racial politics has historically been just swept under the rug politically, institutionally, judicially, within the medical system, culturally and socially, through the society that I grew up in as a young Nova Scotian, and then all of the other political parties that are the product of that same society. I feel that the political parties and Nova Scotians more generally have still not come to terms with the fact that there has never been a post-colonial moment in this province or in this country. We can't find a date when colonization ended, and therefore we can't really be thinking about, you know, what life after colonialism looks like. So this is what it means to live in the colonial present. The colonial project has transformed indeed, but it hasn't ended. But because of the long-term efforts of Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian people in particular, there is irrefutable amounts of evidence, research, testimony, reports, all the things that you need, highlighting the systemic failure of the province of Nova Scotia with regards to the politics of race in particular. So building on these deep foundations of an anti-racist politics and resilience in the face of organized political white supremacy over the last several hundred years, there seems to be now, today, a public awakening and gradual realization among people in this province that there actually are tangible ways to make things better if we confront the politics of race directly. That's what we want to do today. So with that in mind, this panel was convened because we think that all Nova Scotians need to be very direct in asking the political parties who are coming for their votes about their platform and what they want to do to address the politics of race in substantial ways. We want policy, not platitudes. And the women who will be speaking today have an enormous amount of experience organizing and enacting the politics of Mi'kmaq sovereignty, of African resilience and brilliance, generations of solidarity, advocating for equity within the public health care system, and so much more. And with International Women's Day being marked just earlier this week, it's appropriate that we take a moment to recognize that women, and especially racialized women, have been at the core of every successful social justice seeking movement. And at the same time, they are oftentimes not at the forefront of those movements, largely because of fragile masculine egos. So I want to take a few moments to introduce this fantastic panel to you, and then we're going to go right into a kind of curated conversation for everyone. And I would encourage you to take part in the chat as well. We'll be turning to the chat from time to time to take up questions once I move through the first line of questions. So Doreen Bernard is a Mi'kmaq grassroots grandmother, a water protector, water walker, and survivor of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. In 2013, she completed a Master of Social Work in Aboriginal Field of Study from Laurier University. Her 20-year social work career has been in child welfare and community support in Mi'kmaq communities with Shubenacadie Indian Residential School survivors. She was the Coady International Institute Chair on Social Justice in 2017, focusing her work in education on Indigenous issues, treaty rights, environmental racism, climate justice, and reconciliation. Doreen is a volunteer grassroots grandmother in social justice work, child welfare, missing and murdered Indigenous women, promoting cultural teachings about the sacredness of water, the protection of water, and water walk ceremonies. Welcome, Doreen. Arundhati Dara is a family physician in Mi'kma'ki with both inpatient and outpatient practices. She also works with the Dalhousie Medical School and trainees teaching advocacy. Her writing focuses on the intersection of identity politics and medicine and what it means to provide care. Together with colleagues, Aruna and her pals started the Third Rail, a section of the Canadian Family Physician dedicated to talking about justice-oriented topics in medicine and healthcare, and she's been prolific on this front. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, educator, journalist, and community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax. In 2016, Elle was the recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She is a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share their creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. Elle was appointed the Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University between 2017 and 2019. She's the winner of 2 Atlantic Journalism Gold Awards in 2018 and 2019. Her book of spoken word poetry, Live from the African Resistance, was published by Roseway Press in 2014. Elle would like to pay tribute to the many nameless and unrecognized women whose work makes it possible for her to be here today. And I heard she's a very aggressive stretcher when it comes to getting the best treadmill at the gym. Lynn Jones is a proud African Canadian born and raised in Truro, Nova Scotia. Her Nova Scotia roots span several generations, making her one of several Indigenous African Nova Scotians residing here over 400 years. Excuse me. She is a Pan-Africanist whose travel takes her across many countries in her ancestral home on the continent of Africa. Being employed as a federal public service employee for over 30 years, coupled with her extensive experiences in the Canadian labor movement, enabled Lynn to be a social justice leader in areas many Black people have never ventured before. This includes being the first Black general vice president of the Canadian Labor Congress and national vice president of the Canadian Employment and Immigration Union. Lynn leveraged her community and labor background to become the first Canadian-born African woman to seek office in federal election in Canada. Jones is the recipient of the Queen's Medal and chair of the Global African Congress Nova Scotia chapter, an organization which seeks reparations for the atrocities of the Atlantic slave trade. Lynn has been in the vanguard of the fight for fair labor practices for many years, including most recently the joint campaign, Fight for 15, which attempts to win an increase in the minimum wage for all workers. Lynn recently donated over 50 years of personal archival material on the Black local, national, and international community to St. Mary's University's Library and Archives, where it is now housed as the Lynn Jones African, Canadian, and Diaspora Heritage Collection. And if you haven't had a chance to spend some time in that collection, I really urge you to do so. So this is your panel. I think you can all agree with me that there is no one else in this province who is more qualified to speak on this topic. So rather than invite individual presentations, I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll kind of proceed in a more conversational tone. And I want to start with Doreen, please. Doreen, I'd like to start with you because I've learned so much from the way that you enact your sovereignty, if I can put it that way, in terms of your protection of the water. What would be an essential idea, one or two ideas that you think the political parties need to commit to in the coming Nova Scotian election?
Thank you. I think a lot of our work towards our sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, and our asserting our treaty rights is what's needed in not only here in Mi'kma'ki but across the country. Well, we see how we are connected to the land. What we say is our Mother Earth and the water, and our responsibility to protect the water, protect the land, assert our rights to our responsibility to take care of the water, protect our not only the water, all life that depends on Mother Earth and the water to live. And it all comes down to our responsibility for our environment and how we see ourselves as women to protect what's sacred and what's means life to everyone. And what has been happening across the land is that Indigenous people and others have been criminalized in asserting our cultural responsibility, like who we are as Indigenous people, connected to the land and the water, that it's our identity, and we're being criminalized to stand up to protect the water or the land, our rights for our future generations, and that's the I think that's where we see across the land where the governments, provincial, federal, and Indigenous governments have been involved in that policy. They've been involved in that policy through either not consulting with the people who are the treaty rights holders, and also I think the biggest problem is that the government has been making laws. You know, they create the laws, yet they break those laws, because many of the many of the developments that are happening, industrial um, or energy developments, would not be permitted if they were following the laws of the environmental protections. And so that's, I think, our biggest problem is that they continue to push those laws through without our consultation with the treaty rights holders or the people, even the people, but the rest of Canadians are not being heard as well. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is that our treaty rights should not always be having to be adjudicated in courts. You know, our rights that have already been through the court system, they're still breaching those even their own laws, their own court system. So I think we have a lot to do, and we cannot do it alone. We need unity across our lands, across Canada.
It always strikes me, Doreen, if I can push on one of those points, is that when treaty rights become the issue, the government always wants to take it to court. And that court is always the colonial court, right? It's the Nova Scotian or the Canadian court. Why do you think it might be useful for the province to commit to meeting on Mi'kmaq kind of legal terms and to let the Mi'kmaq adjudicate?
Yes, I really believe that that's an answer. We have natural, laws. We have Mi'kmaq laws that for us to follow to protect the land and the water, and the future of our people. And it's meant for all people living on unceded Mi'kma'ki.
That's right. Yeah. No, thanks for that, and we'll come back to some of that. I'd like to turn now to Lynn Jones, please. Lynn, you have a tremendous amount of experience in the organized left, archiving the Black Liberation, and so many other things. And I wonder what are one or two must-haves for you.
First of all, thank you so much, Ajay, and the department for putting this panel together. It's kind of exciting. I've never really been part of a panel with this kind of diversity and of thought, but yet we're all together on many issues. I also, when I was looking at the topic, racial politics, for today's event, I was thinking, how am I gonna deal with this one when we're not even recognized half the time as a race that's worthy of addressing. And I say that because one of the key things that African Nova Scotians have been putting forth is the idea that we are a distinct people. And if you start with that premise as a distinct people, meaning we have, for example, distinct and unique culture and traditions and political practices and social practices, and you juxtapose that with the political system, but yet you don't recognize that distinctness in the process, then of course it presents a problem. I'm thinking of when I ran in the federal election. I think it was, I don't know, a long time ago, and we were planning how we would move through communities. And I remember the party had said, well, we're not going to go into those traditional African Nova Scotians communities because they're not involved in the political process. We need a vote, and they don't vote. So they hadn't even made the connection that, yeah, but it's different this time. You have a Black candidate from those communities who the community knows, who people now can make the connection between their lived realities and the politics of the day. So for you to ask me, like, what are one or two things? I've got a whole list, 10 miles long. And for sure, you don't have time for all of it. So I would pick, and it's not a selfish pick, I would pick an umbrella that would involve all the concerns, and that is the issue of reparations, because we're in the position that we are today as a direct result of, you talked about colonial and colonialism, the fact that we came to this country against our will, and that as a result of that transatlantic slave trade, there's all these other injustices that we've had to face. So whether we're talking about justice for elections or land claims or all these things, it all means that things have been stolen from us, and we haven't had our just due, and that reparations are due. There's not been one case, which we've been talking it, and you'll be surprised, but there's not one case of reparations that's been settled in this whole country. Yet we're seeing other areas. For example, it's a hot topic, for example, in the United States elections system, the Caribbean, and they even have a reparations institute. So I would say that that for sure is an issue from a political perspective that needs to be addressed. When we move into an area which you might say, well, Lynn, this has been on the table for a long time, but African Nova Scotians have been asking since time immemorial for sustainable and related employment. When you have the unemployment statistics that we experience in our community, and it's even more prevalent during this time of the pandemic, I think you'd also your eyes would be open to know that there is not one dedicated Black institution that has funding or had government support to deal with the issue of employment in our communities. None, not one. So employment may be resolved in the wider community. I'll have a drink here, thank you. It's lemon juice. Excuse me, sorry. Employment, again, we're highly unemployed, and the employment that we do have is that in precarious types of employment. I won't get into all those issues, but that also relates to our housing crises that needs to be addressed. That's why, Jai, it's very hard for me to say that there's these one or two things, because none of our issues have been seriously dealt with through the issue of big P politics, right, although it's discussed in the community with the little p politics. So I'll stop there because I'm sure there's lots of areas.
Thank you for that, Lynn. And I appreciate setting up the umbrella, as you put it, of reparations, because already, and maybe we can come back to this, already I can see how reparations could be the rubric through which we start thinking about what this looks like in terms of policy commitments. So I'm going to turn over to Elle now. Elle, although policing tends to be a municipal jurisdiction, do you think that there are any kind of guiding criteria that parties could insist on in terms of holding municipalities to account in terms of how they go about defunding the police or reorganize their funding priorities? That's just, like that, or any other aspect of this. I know that you've done a lot of work on that issue in particular, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Lynn, Doreen, and Aruna as well on this panel, and everybody attending. I'm going to shift the question a little bit. So yes, obviously policing is municipal commitment. Almost $90 million of money goes into policing. But of course, provincial jails, for example, over $72 million goes into our provincial justice system just in incarceration alone. And then when we look federally, we have, I think it's 42 or something like that, $billion when we take in all accounts of containment, discipline, policing. So everything from border policing, all the way through our systems of punishment. So the issue here is around an ideology of punishment, containment, and discipline that persists throughout our society, and it is tied to many other social issues. So when we talk about defunding, people, first of all, I think of it in terms of this framework of taking away. Okay, so you're defunding, so what you want to do is strip things. But I think this is one reason why, of course, we propose an abolitionist model, which isn't just about getting rid of prisons and police. What it's actually about is imagining a different kind of world. And that's what the project really is. So when we talk about defunding police, there's a kind of capitalist reading where people can still be somewhat comfortable with it, as in like, oh, so you move money from one column to another column. So that makes sense. Okay, we're still dealing with money. Like, it's still about capitalism. Abolition is saying, well, we need to rethink our relationship to everything in society. So we need to rethink our relationship to capitalism. We cannot, of course, deal with punishment and justice without, as Doreen has spoken about, Indigenous sovereignty underlies absolutely everything, which is why we have the slogan, no justice on stolen land, right? That we cannot talk about a prison system without talking about a history of colonization, a history of violence. There's a reason that 44% of our federal prisons now are Indigenous women, and it's not because there's a crime wave of Indigenous women. It's because of colonization and violence against Indigenous peoples that continues. As Doreen very clearly laid out, the policing of women who are simply defending water and defending land. And Doreen herself has been arrested while simply defending our clean water. So we know that the punishment system is not about who's a bad person and who's harming communities. It's about protecting power and resources. And Indigenous sovereignty is, in fact, one of the greatest threats, if not the greatest threat, to the oil and energy industry, because without Indigenous consent, of course, the pipelines cannot flow. So Indigenous people are literally putting bodies on the land and putting lives on the line for all of us, and is really in some ways our only fight against neoliberal resource development. And we understand that that is why Indigenous people continue to be criminalized and have been criminalized since the beginning of so-called Canada. So we cannot, of course, talk about these issues with policing without recognizing the RCMP's colonial role at our borders, at, you know, pushing to the west, pushing through the north. They're a frontier police. They're involved in residential schools, returning children. So we cannot just say, okay, so we just put some more money into housing without saying, why do Indigenous people continue to be criminalized and policed? We can't talk about this without anti-Blackness at our borders. We don't even keep numbers as usual in Canada, but we know our immigration detention facilities are absolutely filled with people of African descent. Jamaicans, Somali, Nigerians, Haitians make up very much the people who were targeted for deportation. We have a Ministry of Public Safety, which is not responsible for getting us childcare and housing and food. It's guns, drugs, gangs, borders, largely all based in anti-Blackness, right? Because like, who are we trying to stop from coming across the border? Who do we label as being in gangs? Also, Indigenous people, of course, are highly labeled as being gang members as well, right? So just to all say that the policing issue is actually an issue of enslavement and its afterlife, and of the residential schools afterlife, and the continued afterlife of colonialism that we continue to live out. We can't talk about defunding without talking about the environment, why prisons are built in rural communities that have lost resources and livelihood and are seen as an economic boon. So we look at, you know, the women's prison in Truro, like the prisons in Spring Hill that used to have a mining industry, Renouf outside of Miramichi. You know, these are all small towns that have largely lost many of the ways that people had of living in the industries, and a prison comes in and offers a kind of economic benefit. And there's also a class analysis here, right? That working class people are sold the notion of working as a prison guard or getting a contract in the jail. So we can't separate out particularly a class reading also of the economy, of why we have a prison industrial complex, who is swept up in that: poor people, racialized people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities. Over 50% of incarcerated women are women with disabilities, often cognitive damage from facing abuse, right? Like, we can't rethink, obviously, policing without thinking our relationship to capitalism and property, right? Santina Reo is beaten down in the Walmart over shoplifting. That is a property issue. George Floyd is killed over an alleged $20 bill, a bad bill. So quite literally, Black lives are lost on the altar of capitalist consumption. And of course, all throughout the history of anti-Blackness, the roots are in our theft of labor and the use of us as property. So we can't talk about policing without reanalyzing that relationship to capitalism. So I can go on, and in every site that we talk about, we recognize that punishment exists at those sites, that containment and discipline exists at those sites. And the conversation about policing is not simply narrowly about street checks or about body cameras or about like getting more Black cops. It's about rethinking a society that disposes of certain people, that sees people outside of the thin blue line, the chaos that needs to be held back, sex workers, queer people, trans people, people living with drug addictions, people living in homelessness, people experiencing mental illness, people that are all seen as outside the public good. And then the notion of the public, who is kept safe by the Minister of Public Safety by deporting, jailing, and harming other people. And our notion of safety is predicated on that. But we believe that true safety is found in housing people, in teaching people how to heal, in addressing trauma, in offering treatment, in making sure people can raise their children safely, in having food sovereignty in our communities, in accepting Indigenous land claims and learning to live on Indigenous terms in these territories that we acknowledge as Indigenous, yet don't do anything to actually live in ways that like actually give sovereignty to Indigenous people. The last thing I'll say, because I could go on and on about this, is that during COVID, we were able to release 41% of prisoners during the first wave of COVID provincially. It cost $271 a day to incarcerate people. It costs about $125 a day to hold people in supportive housing with social work access, with groceries, with everything provided. So less than half the cost. And we did not experience a crime wave. We did not experience suddenly people being murdered and raped on the streets. Yet we cut the housing grants and like basically have worked to return people to jail. And that once and for all should show us the myth of this punishment system, the idea that it's keeping us safe and bad people go to jail, when in fact, we showed that we can let out almost half of our prison population at much cheaper cost with no social harm to us, and showing that we are largely incarcerating people for minor things, for like shoplifting cigarettes, Meanwhile, of course, the biggest theft that people experience is employee wage theft. But you can't call 911 because your boss is making you work overtime and isn't paying you for closing the store. That's the biggest amount of theft. Like environmental damage, you cannot sue or charge an oil company or an energy company for harming us. People kill people on work sites all the time through neglect, and they get a small fine. So we have to recognize that this category that we call crime and that claim that we need policing to maintain is largely a category defining the powerless from the powerful, and the powerful always get to choose to define that category. So whether or not, so what is the provincial responsibility? Housing. What is the provincial responsibility? Adequate social assistance. What is the provincial responsibility? Daycare. A universal living income. That's what we need, like UBI for sure, all of those things, which also of course intersect with Black communities being unresourced, with the lack of any kind of support for us. Those are the things that actually lead to a safe and healthy society. And that's what the Defunding Project is about. It's at all levels, because obviously these issues exist at all levels of government as well.
Thank you, Elle. That was comprehensive, and I hope that the listeners out there can see the kind of obvious points of overlap here between what we've talked about so far in terms of Indigenous sovereignty, in terms of reparations, in terms of shifting to our whole kind of political thinking process away from just plugging a hole here and there to a new model that actually makes space for everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about healthcare now as we move to Aruna, something that's been on everybody's mind, no doubt. And Aruna, everybody's thinking about healthcare, and I'm wondering about, you have a very unique standpoint in a lot of ways. So what do you think needs to happen? What do these parties need to commit to from the perspective of kind of health policy?
So at the risk of repeating what the other fine people on this panel have said, I think, suggesting that health outcomes, so, premature death from heart attack is disconnected from Indigenous sovereignty, is disconnected from employment, is disconnected from, housing, and all of those other things is not true. We know that empirically. They're called the social determinants of health, and we know that these things have more effect on the health outcomes of individuals, particularly racialized individuals, than anything that I might do in a clinic or a hospital, like those things matter much more, and we know that. And so I think that one of the things that, you know, from a policy perspective that we could consider doing is really acknowledging and de-siloing that. So putting all of our money into, you know, what the work that we're doing in hospitals, while it is good to do work in hospitals, folks are going to need care in hospitals. But thinking about that hospital stay is disconnected to someone's lack of pharmacare or lack of safe housing or all of the other things that are that impact their health, I think is a first kind of provincial responsibility. I think we have, you know, we kind of poke at this at the margins a little bit. We have liaisons and we have these other kinds of, not, to be frank, not robust enough systems to really address where folks are and where they need to be to really optimize their health. So from a healthcare perspective, I think that's a really important kind of provincial responsibility. You know, one of the things that I've also thought about, and I thought about this a lot in terms of, I'm not as eloquent as any of the other folks on this panel, but I could certainly, you know, go on for a really long time about this, but I wanted to be really concrete. And I wanted to think about ways to reimagine. And so when I was thinking about this, I was looking at other jurisdictions, and there are jurisdictions that have citizens councils. And so there are like random samplings of folks that like get together and like advise on a policy or make a constitution. And there are a number of different jurisdictions that have these types of citizens councils. So, and to what extent they're effective or not is kind of that's a different question entirely. And I'm not a scholar on that. I feel like someone at the McEachern is, so they should be answering that piece. But one of the things I wonder about is for issues for which I, as a settler colonist, am not actually qualified to make a recommendation. Perhaps there are citizens councils or some version of that need to happen to advise governments about what's going on with respect to policies around everything, because ultimately that's going to impact people's health substantially more than whatever I might be doing in the hospital system. And it speaks to one other thing that I hear a lot of that I don't disagree with, which is that representation matters. So we don't have enough Indigenous healthcare providers, and we don't have enough Black healthcare providers, and we don't see the people who I want to see treating patients, because we know that care is better with diversity. We just know that that is better. So, but representation has to matter in a number of different ways. It can't just matter at the front line. It has to matter at the back end. And by that, I mean things like valuing the kinds of care that is provided in communities. So I know from my experiences working in an Indigenous population, I know by working at a hospital that services a number of Black communities, that care looks different. And often care doesn't look like what the hospital system, what the government, what the regulations tell us is care. So I'll give you a really small example of that. So right now I'm in the hospital, and there are folks families who are saying, you know what, my elderly loved one, I can't care for them anymore. They can't stay at home any longer. I don't think it's safe. I think they need to go to a long-term care facility. And, you know, the provincial hospital, NSHA, whoever, all the muckety mucks, the response is, well, they haven't had any home care. And so because our goal is to keep people in their home for as long as possible, they need to accept some home care before we can entertain the idea of them going to long-term care. And to that, I push back and say, what's care? Who's providing that care? What does care look like? In the communities that I have had the privilege of working in and for, care looks different. And folks who are providing care in incredibly sensitive, culturally competent, familiar ways. And I would say that recognizing that would go a long way towards helping a lot of people who feel really alienated from the healthcare system feel much more secure inside it. And so what I would say from a political system or from a political party system is, you know, you have to find ways to listen and then enact the things that those communities are telling you. And I'll stop there because there are people I want to hear from.
Thank you so much for that, Aruna. I think that point about like is the government even qualified to be culturally understanding what care looks like is such an important point. Think about that even in terms of like my own family and extended family. My wife's grandfather is in his late 90s and technically has never had home care. But what do you think his daughter has been doing for the last 10, 15 years, if not home care? It's not bureaucratized as such. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. So we're going to move now to a kind of general open discussion within the panel. So I was wondering if we could shift to the gallery mode, and then so everybody can be on the screen at the same time. And then as we take this up, I wonder if it wouldn't be useful in the next 10 minutes or so for us to think about maybe the broad umbrella of what reparations could do in terms of like thinking through policy options. Because I'll tell you, just from what I heard from the four of you, I've heard about reparations, I've heard about the importance of Indigenous sovereignty being negotiated on Mi'kmaq terms as opposed to on provincial terms. I've heard about the necessity of shifting the system of punishment away from punishment and crime to abolition, and then relatedly, the need to de-silo our funding and political priorities to make space for genuine care, and to stop seeing everything as discrete little pockets of problems to be dealt with by one ministry or another. So the reason I'm thinking this is that it sounds like maybe we could think about reparations in a broad sense. And Lynn, I'll look to you for some guidance here too, because I know that reparations has to be something very specific to the African Nova Scotian experience. But here I'm wondering about reparations for this ongoing process of colonization too. So why don't I start with you, Lynn? Do you think that's a useful rubric, or do you think that we do harm by kind of overly broadening what the original reparations intent is about? Oh, I think you're muted, Lynn.
Sorry about that. I had to find the cursor to figure out how to get the mute off. I think that the term reparations is not exclusive, for example, to African people. As a matter of fact, one in some ways would think it is, because there's many groups that have actually received reparations. I won't get into the history of that even in Canada, but the call that I make is for reparations for African people. So reparations can go across all different groups. In the case of African people, we talk about the crime against humanity that has been perpetrated as a result of the Atlantic slave trade, and the fact that the government has refused to acknowledge that crime and what goes along with it. But if you do it from a broad perspective, which is what I think you're suggesting, Ajay, we have what's called the 12 fundamental principles of reparations. And I won't go through all 12 of those, but I think that some of them bear taking note of. And the first one being the validation of our humanity, because we've recognized that hasn't been validated, and we've not been dealt with in terms of that perspective. For reparations, for us, it's the knowledge of our history, and that's been denied. We just went through, you mentioned International Women's Day, but we acknowledge African History Month or African Heritage Month, and because that has been denied. So how can we move into looking at what we're asking for if we don't look at that history? There's the compensation perspective. I know Doreen talks about a lot in the sovereignty issues about compensation is a term too, but it's compensation that is, in our case, appropriate to the crime. So you've committed this crime. If we're to get reparations, then we must be compensated in proportion to that. And actually, we haven't received any compensation, period. So that's not hard to figure out. No one must be left behind. I loved when Doreen was talking earlier, the participants weren't privy to that discussion where she said Elle had requested something and Doreen said, I need to go back and talk to the other grandmothers in that process. Well, in reparations, there's a principle that no one is left behind. So it's not for the academics. It is for the academics, but it's also for the people, the laborers. It's also for everybody within the society is what we're talking about in terms of reparations. Like I said, there's 12 fundamental principles. It talks about repairing ourselves, self-repair, talks about health, which Aruna spoke to. But I think the bottom line in the whole reparations, whether it be when we speak from an African people's perspective or any perspective, is that in determining the crime and in talking about what compensation there will be for the crime, it's the people have to be engaged. And the people have to say what it is they want. Sometimes people will say to me, well, what exactly is it that you guys want? Like, in terms of reparations. And I will say, well, we don't even have the resources to take that concern to our communities. That's how bad a shape that we're in to find out what it is that people want. So I don't know if that's answering your questions in terms of.
No, it very much does. It very much does, and it makes me think, in terms of broadening out the question to the other panelists here too. If reparations then can operate in some form of rubric, what it sounds like you're speaking to, and what many people have spoken to, is a fundamental need to not just reallocate money, but to do things differently. Procedurally, things need to be different. And, everyone wasn't privy to what Doreen and Ellen were talking about earlier, but, maybe Doreen, can I ask you to step in and talk about maybe some of the differences procedurally in terms of how you would want to, engage even in a policy conversation? Because one of the things that we took away from your talk was that, if the province wants to talk nation to nation, then they should be doing it on Mi'kmaq terms. So what would that look like in terms of being different from, how, paint a picture for us, if you could, about what would be different from the Nova Scotia.
Well, I know what's happening right now is not working. That's all I can say. How things have been done so far has not been working for us as Indigenous people in a lot of ways where we question, those decisions that are being made without us, without our input, and knowing that these are not decisions that are under the Indian Act, under the Indian Act governments that are for the reservations itself. These are decisions that impact our treaty rights, our rights as Indigenous people, as individuals, but also impacts our children and our grandchildren and the next 7 generations in front of us. And so I feel like there's a lot of work to be done in our own governments, within Indigenous governments that represent our people with the federal and provincial governments here in Nova Scotia, but across Mi'kmaq, I would think, because we don't agree.
Yeah.
We don't agree with the things that are happening, and we find ourselves on the front lines of decisions that have been made without any input, and these are things that have been in the making for years. 5 years, 7 years with Alton Gas, it's was since 2003, and we find ourselves on the front line in 2015. Just incredulous. How did we get there without any knowledge? That's just one example, and it's not only for proponents on in energy sectors. It's also for healthcare and child welfare and every aspect of our lives.
Mhm.
Under the Indian Act, that racist, policy legislation, government legislation, we're still living under that into 2020, and people don't realize, how much it impacts our everyday lives, and not from birth to death.
Uh-huh.
And and I think we need to help people realize, because our history has not been taught, in the schools, and we've seen the racism and all the explosion of racism during the summer, the fall with the fishery.
Yeah.
People, even
Yeah.
Acadian people didn't even know their own history either. And
Mhm.
it was really eye opening
Mhm.
for everyone. And today, the policies that the government are still putting in place put our lives at risk again and more,
Uh-huh.
in for the future. So I think, yeah, it's the policies of the government, knowing full well that there has not been Indigenous involvement. I
Mm.
would say with the people whose rights, treaty rights, sovereignty, on our unceded lands, in our waters, our
Uh-huh.
resources are being affected. And yeah, this is something that we need put that education out there
Mhm.
about what that really means on the ground when we're standing in front of these things, and um, how people often think, when they run out of choices, when they run out of options, they look to Indigenous people to stand for their rights, so their land and their water will be protected. That this is how things have been going for a long time,
Mhm.
and now we just need to tell everybody it's their responsibility to. We're in this. We live here. This is our land and our water. These are our rights to our resources. Yeah, that's
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Doreen. We only have a few minutes left, so I just want to open it to Aruna and Elle to comment on this. Thank you, Lynn.
Well, I thought maybe we could tie it into Catherine's question. So
Sure.
Catherine has a quote from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report around men controlling all spheres, so the public and the private, and then asks the question, when someone holds all the cards in the game, how do we stop playing along with the same game, i.e. systems of white supremacy or patriarchy, etc. So maybe we could take that question up.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has an answer.
Does anyone have an answer to that?
I mean, I think the answer is collective organizing. I made this point already in a Zoom like 2 days ago, but part of the neoliberal system is that it likes us to believe there's no way out of the system, right? So we come to believe it's totalizing. They're in our phones, they're surveying me, they know every conversation I'm having, they know where I'm going, there's police on my block, there's cameras, so we start to feel that it's everywhere. And it is true, like we live in a carceral state where, meaning like a prison state, like, you're surveyed at work, they have keynote technology, and the prison makes its way through the whole society. But the thing is that can like dampen our organizing, because then we feel like, oh, there's no point in organizing, because what are we going to do? They're always going to win. So the answer to that is, of course, collective organizing across class, across race, across that we all have to recognize a shared interest that we have in justice. An example I like to give is in the prison abolition movement. You have people that come in as like hardcore, like theoretical abolitionists. You have like Black and Indigenous people that come in obviously through a lens of like race and colonization. And then you have people whose like family died in prison, who maybe weren't political at all, and they're from, some small town, and they're white, and they maybe have never had like a racial analysis. And they'll say, I believe that when they said you'll get the help for your drug addiction in there, I thought that was true. And then, the next call I get is like, my kid is dead. And we work together, right? So sometimes people are quite at the beginning, like, why are we talking about Indigenous people? Like, my sister was white and she died. And, like, we work together to build that coalition because we have the same goal, to end this system. So that kind of coalition organizing is really important, to be done across generations. We can obviously learn, like, we don't all have to share every single belief the same. And I think yeah, we increasingly, I don't know. I mean, if I have one thing, this is why I always go on about like the political reading, not as like an elitist thing. It's not because the reading is held apart from people. It's because it belongs to people. These ideas belong to everybody. Everybody can and should liberate themselves. You don't have to be an expert. And there's many people that came before us. I'm like, was reading Rocky's book the other day because issues come up in my life, and then I'm like reading Rocky's book, which I have sitting right here because I'm literally like reading it. Here we are, Rocky Jones Revolutionary. And when Rocky's talking about things, I'm experiencing those things. Like, that's why it's just really important, and then talking to our elders, like Lynn Jones, like every day has something to say about an organizing principle, a piece of wisdom that you can apply. And when we apply those things, we know it works because we know that we have won these battles. So I think we really have to resist like the separation and the like, we're only doing this on Twitter and you have to know the right language. And, if you don't have everything, like we work together and we train and teach each other as we work. And I think that's how we win. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Elle. Aruna, we only have about 2.5 minutes left. Would you like to add anything in kind of closing?
First of all, to just pick up on what Elle was saying, in an incredibly positive way, one of the things that I have noticed after having come to this place, and elsewhere too, I would say, is that there's this the language of diversity and equity often ends up pitting groups against one another. And what Elle was talking about really resonated with me in that, the solidarity between different groups is maybe the most revolutionary and dangerous thing for a system designed to keep folks apart who have those common interests, who can come together. And so that is women, that is the marginalized, that is, those who are not housed properly, that is Indigenous people, that is Black people, that is all of these different groups. There are so many things that collectively folks have in common. And that, resisting the urge to pit folks against one another, and this is from a policy perspective, pitting folks against one another, whether it's for resources, whether it's for language, whether it's for representation, is ultimately not okay. So more is better is maybe that's my last word. More is better.
More is better. Thank you for that. So just as we move to a conclusion, what I want to do here is just kind of, again, list some of the policy relevant suggestions that came out of this panel so that all of the politicians who are listening or watching, take note. This is the minimum criteria if you want people to take you seriously on racial politics. So the first thing, in terms of respecting Indigenous sovereignty. If you are to respect Indigenous sovereignty, that doesn't mean respecting Indigenous sovereignty in the Nova Scotia courts. What it means is looking for avenues to meet with Mi'kmaq people in Mi'kma'ki on Mi'kmaq legal terms and to make your case to Mi'kmaq people on Mi'kmaq legal principles. So that means you have to do the work to do that and write that into policy. Another thing I heard was think seriously about the politics of reparations and what the politics of and the policy outcomes of reparations means to the African Nova Scotian community. The African Nova Scotian community has, as Lynn has articulated, has asked for things like distinct society status. This is something that Canada has given to the Quebec nation. It is not unprecedented. This is a workable policy framework to think through. As well as funding certain employment opportunity ventures which have not been funded before. We need to think about shifting the rubric of punishment within the penal system towards something more about abolition that involves transformations of the way that we think about like organizing society itself. And this folds into what Aruna said as well about moving past silos so that we are not pitting interest groups against one another, but rather reorganizing the funds and resources that we have to make it better for everyone. More is better, as she said. So there are other things here. These are the last few that I picked up. We're actually at time now. So I put the question to you, the political parties of Nova Scotia, which one of you is brave enough to actually develop this into a policy framework? Because if you do that, and it's the minimum requirement, if you do the minimum requirement, there's a lot of people who would probably vote for you. If you don't, there's a lot of people who aren't going to. So with that, I want to just thank all of these brilliant panelists for their contributions to this on behalf of the McEachern Institute. You really made this, I think, pop as the last in our series. And thank you for all the work that you do.